Until I was 26 years old, I spoke only English. And then, in a matter of about 5 months, I went from no Spanish proficiency to intermediate to maybe slightly advanced conversational fluency living in Texas. Part of the reason I was able to do that is because I was organized and systematic in how I approached my language learning. Now, I'm setting out to learn my second language, or my third language, which is French. And what I want to do in this video is I want to share with you first a little about how I went about learning Spanish in the first place, what my methodology looked like. And now that I've been through that process, I know what it looks like to go from no Spanish or no fluency in another language to intermediate proficiency, and then from intermediate to more advanced. Now that I know what that process looks like, I'm gonna repeat it. I'm starting over from scratch again, getting rid of the things that I feel like I could clean up. So there's certain things that I'm gonna be doing exactly the same because I know that they work, and there's other things that I feel like I could clean up and make better this time around. I wanna share with you those things here in this video. Empecemos.
This is Mr. Optimized.
So let's begin with how I learned Spanish in the first place. 5 months is not an exaggeration. 5 months is the time I went back and I looked at my records as to when I first subscribed to the primary language learning program that I subscribed to, and when I then later canceled it. It was about a 5-month period where I was living in Texas. The amount of time I lived in Texas total was about 1.5 years, but that 5-month period was the period where I was really focused. I was using just one primary language program, and then I was doing a couple of other things simultaneously, and I'll talk about those here too. But the very first thing that I did to teach myself Spanish was I subscribed to a language learning app called Pimsleur. Not Duolingo. I suspect a lot of you probably were predicting that I would say Duolingo. Whenever I talk about this and I tell people I used a language learning app to learn Spanish, they always guess Duolingo, which is so funny to me. I don't particularly care for Duolingo. I don't have anything specifically against it necessarily. I never got into it, and I just know that Pimsleur worked for me. And I know it's worked for a lot of other people. Pimsleur is a little bit lesser known. It's a little more underground. But the way that it works is you listen to a native speaker speak, and they'll introduce you gently to new phrases in 30-minute increments, which are one lesson per day. So every lesson is about 30 minutes, and you take one per day. And the way it works is you hear them say the phrase, they'll tell you the meaning in English so that you understand. And the first thing you practice is just simply pronunciation so that you can actually say the words correctly and speak the language correctly, which was very important to me. I feel like it's a huge advantage of Pimsleur, which is not emphasized necessarily. You practice the pronunciation, and then they also, which is sort of the main selling point of the entire program, they drill into your head. They drill repetition, that phrase in increasingly spaced increments so that it gets pushed further and further back into your long-term memory. And that way you actually remember and can recall on command those phrases that you're learning. And that's completely different than trying to study the language consciously through grammar understanding, which just doesn't work. In combination with the language learning program, I also had the good fortune of being in a context for that 5-month period where I could practice the phrases that I was learning in real time and in a real world context. And what that was for me was I worked at a Walgreens in North Austin, where I would have people that came in that not only spoke Spanish, but only spoke Spanish. And that's a huge advantage because as you'll learn as you go on in your language learning journey, when you try to practice a second language with somebody that knows that language but also English, they'll tend to default back to English once they realize that you're struggling. And they mean well, but unless you explicitly say, hey, like I want to stay in Spanish, they won't do that. So you have to be very explicit, and then even sometimes some people just prefer to speak to you in English because it's just easier. Whereas if you have the opportunity to be in a context where the people that you're speaking with, and especially if you're responsible for helping them, like I was in customer service, helping those that came in that only spoke Spanish, it's much easier because they're so grateful that you even understand a tiny bit of Spanish. And of course, they don't have the option to go back to English because they don't understand English. That is a great opportunity to practice the phrases that you're learning. And there are also key phrases that you can learn that make it faster to learn new phrases in that real world context. For example, what does it mean? What does that mean? What does this mean? That is a key phrase, obviously, that then when you ask someone, a native speaker, as you're in real world context, you can learn those new words and phrases as you go. It makes the language learning much faster. Okay, and then the next most important thing that I did in conjunction with these other two, during that 5-month period, I also focused pretty intensely on seeing to it that I would consume the language. Okay, so whether I was practicing reading the language with audiobooks or with physical books, or whether I was listening to the language, I tried to search out music. I don't really care for podcasts, but of course that's an option too. I did try it, but I never got into them. And then the thing that I probably spent the most time doing, which is watching YouTube videos. And I have a video that I'll link up in the corner right now if you're curious, where I show you how you can categorize your YouTube feeds to have dedicated types of YouTube feeds, where, for example, I'll have a personal channel, is what they are. You can create multiple channels within one account, so you don't have to manage multiple accounts. You create different channels, and what you're able to do is, for a personal channel, for example, I'll have just like entertainment content, if that's what I'm into, whatever kind of content I just want to watch, like by default. And then I'll have a channel dedicated to Spanish only. For whatever content I consume, it's going to all be in Spanish. And then I can do the same thing now that I'm learning French. I have another channel that I've created that's only for consuming French language content. Now that I'm learning French, there are some things that are going to be exactly the same as when I learned Spanish because I know that they work. But there are also going to have to be some adjustments because of the difference between Spanish and French. So first of all, I'm going to be starting the language learning journey in the exact same way with daily Pimsleur lessons, 30 minutes a day. It's as simple as committing to it and making the daily lesson happen every single day. Sometimes it can be easier said than done, but if you have the right systems in place, it's a lot easier, and we talk about that in other videos. One of the things that's different this time around, though, is because I don't have the same context that I had with Spanish, where I could very actively, consistently practice the exact phrases I was learning with the people I had the opportunity to practice with. With French, I don't have that opportunity readily available. It's not as easy to find native French speakers in the States. I'm sure that exists, but it's not nearly as common as Spanish. I plan to, therefore, combine Pimsleur French lessons with tactical, targeted practice of the specific words and phrases that I learn with AI and/or tutors online. In order to do that, I have to be able to capture the specific words and phrases that I'm learning in Pimsleur in some kind of, probably a database. That's what I've started with in Notion, which again, we'll talk about that in other videos as well, especially as the system evolves over time. But the idea is I capture the specific words and phrases that I'm actually learning, one word or phrase at a time, in a database, and I collect that all in one place, and then I have that central repository, I think is what like the data nerds call it. That will give me something to point to, either an AI chatbot or a tutor or something along those lines to say, okay, look, I want you to practice with me these specific words and phrases. Try your best to use only these words and phrases because these are the ones that I actually understand. And then intersperse sparingly other words and phrases so that I can slowly build vocabulary using that as my foundation.